The game company Bohemia Interactive relies on its own engine called Infusion. Its development accelerated about 5 years ago. The first game built in part on Infusion is the 10-year-old DayZ. Fully within this engine is the first title, Arma Reforger, launched in May 2022, and which has just left early access. It will be followed by Arma 4 and possibly other titles like DayZ 2. Infusion is based on the real virtuality engine used in the Arma series and the virtually unknown Enforce engine. Bohemia Interactive has 20 years of experience in game development. During that time, it has not gone bankrupt or been taken over by anyone. This is a remarkable feat in the games industry, and it is doing very well financially. The financial status was also improved by the entry of Chinese investor Teardown in 2021, to whom a stake in the company was sold for an unspecified amount, which was probably in the range of billions of Czech crowns. BI developers usually have good and original ideas. They make interesting games, but technically it is very bad. This is despite the fact that this is not a garage company that can't afford really good designers and programmers. But priorities are different. Unfortunately, even with the new engine and the new title, nothing has changed in the approach. For your money, you get a product that is broken at its very core. The game is still missing at least one half of the things promised in the roadmap. And, somewhat surprisingly, some aspects of the game are worse than they were before its release. And worse is the overall feel of the project, which showed its final outline with version 1.0, not for players looking for something more challenging. Arma Reforger has changed quite a bit in the year and a half since its release. The original big plus was that the game tried to feel quite natural and was mostly a joy to watch. What players will appreciate are the quality of the game's assets and the nicely crafted game environment. Compared to the Arma series in DayZ, there's a noticeable shift in lighting, PBR materials, much more detail. But in the competition of today's games, it's nothing too revolutionary, and it's questionable what reserve there is for future titles. However, after the initial look around, you may start to notice a lot of strange things. Renderer has a lot of problems with the quality representation of the game world, and even in the graphical concept there are now a lot of question marks. Lighting, materials, and the subsequent post-processing of the image mostly influence how the game looks. Since version 1.0, lighting is completely broken. As the developers tried to change certain aspects, it started to fall apart under their hands elsewhere. It's quite possible that the lighting is all badly done in the engine, or it's going to get a total overhaul. The picture constantly goes into very strange tones as you move around the map, as the game time and weather changes. Mostly what you see is white or white-green overlit crap. The game in general tends to look pretty unnaturally metallic sharp. This has been done before to some extent, but combined with the white tint, it's pure hell. Another thing that ruins the impression are the exaggerated post-process effects. The developers had a really weird idea that the image should constantly change, lighten, and darken. In the real world, nothing like that happens. The human eye can reasonably cover the differences between the interior of a house and a sun-drenched street. It also negatively affects gameplay. You can't see enemies in the flood of light. It's really tiring to watch the image parameters change constantly. The 3D scene in games looks best when there is higher contrast and a rather limited color palette. Realistically, a game could look very good, have a good atmosphere. Before version 1.0, it was pretty much on track. Now it's another wasted potential. Night has also undergone several changes. The best was about a year ago. As long as you could see the stars and the moon, you could play relatively normally. With subsequent versions of the game, it turned into an unplayable pitch-black darkness. In version 1.0, the night is reduced so that you don't have to use flashlights or lights on vehicles. You can also set the server to bright night. The game looks like an ugly gray day. One of the major problems is that the game fails to prepare the scene for rendering. Objects are not rendered at all or delayed when looking around with the camera. Even the same objects you normally saw a few milliseconds ago are forgotten because you turned the camera elsewhere. There is usually something visibly glitching on the screen. In the outdoors, it's rather unnoticeable, but in populated areas and interiors, it's very bad. Can see a range of image artifacts, predominantly the more effect and edge smoothing issues. There is very little difference between anti-aliasing on and off. There are also levitating objects and dead players in grotesque poses. Furthermore, there are serious smoothness issues even though the FPS doesn't drop. The image stutters when looking around with the camera, although they tried to improve it a bit in version 1.0. Character animations also stutter or are weirdly sped up. Moving objects are interpolated poorly in multiplayer. In fact, almost everything tends to fall into chaos. The rendering of objects in the distance isn't the best either. They are changing too visibly. Other engines are already trying to eliminate this trend. For example, in the Unreal Engine, the nanite system should address it, so that 3D objects no longer have to have their detail levels manually created according to the distance they are displayed. There are dozens of rendering and graphics problems. Additionally, just like in Arma 3, objects have pretty weird colliders, so if you're standing on an object, you're usually several tens of centimeters above it. Why this hasn't moved anywhere is a bit of a mystery. What's really good? Objects can be distinguished at distances of tens and hundreds of meters. This is no longer common in modern games. Most of the new engines, especially Unreal Engine 5, are made more for third-person corridor games that feel a bit claustrophobic. As for similar FPS games, for example in Hell Let Loose made in Unreal Engine 4, you can't even recognize larger objects in the low tens of meters. Games with ray tracing are much worse. There you have to hide the pixel artifacts that are created during rendering with a blur. The maximum draw distance is 5 kilometers, and by default it is set to 2,500 meters. If you're sitting in a helicopter, you'll appreciate the full range mainly for orientation on the map. On the official servers, the range is limited to 1,700 meters since version 1.0. The rest is covered by fog. This is a big downgrade, as there was no limitation before. In addition, the distance at which players and vehicles are displayed in multiplayer is limited to 700 meters. This is to ease network traffic, and you will notice it especially with helicopters, they simply disappear from the screen. Or if you're looking through binoculars, you'll often see soldiers with invisible weapons and no animations. Additionally, looking through optics brings classic problems. Grass only renders at shorter distances. FPS drops and detail levels disappear for both 2D and 3D optics. Vehicle sights aren't any better either. They don't work. A miracle can still happen with the visuals and some major changes can occur, but the real disaster is here. Like previous titles, Reforger is unfinished, hugely bugged, and there are various placeholders. Instead of one thing really being finished, more new things are added. And the technical precision is also lacking. All of this creates a situation where almost nothing is finished, and players will see the same problems in any upcoming titles. Bohemia Interactive repeats the same approach over and over again, even when it comes to new engine and new projects. Some parts of the engine are probably poorly designed and programmed from the ground up. It is noticeable in the game. The base of the engine should be bulletproof, but it isn't. Reforger still has maybe 1 to 1.5 years of development ahead of it when they implement things from the roadmap. After that, people will move fully on to Arma 4. Even key games like DayZ have not received enough work. After 10 years, there are some really scary things that no one has fixed. They just moved on. While DayZ is a goldmine for BI, the unfixed stuff from Reforger will simply be in Arma 4 and DayZ 2.
Yeah, it may seem it took a long time, but it was crucial to focus on system refactors first to make sure that all the core features have strong technical foundation. As well as to address many bug fixes early on, because we are building on scratch on the all-new Fusion engine. We have delivered ground support, but there is still a lot to be done, so why we are leaving early access?
Here comes the money!
Here we go, money talk!
Here comes the money!
Вы меня рассмешили.
Meet Fran Stalinaskevich Davidovitsky.
Oh.
Because of course we can polish forever, we can make sure that, like every nook and cranny is taken care of, but at the same time, we don't want to keep you waiting for too long. So when is the feature ready for release? When is the quality good enough? Is the question that we're asking ourselves every day. In the vanilla game, we are trying to provide a good baseline experience that can be enjoyed standalone.
Know them, friend.
In 18 months, many things have changed for the better, but mostly only slightly. It's a very gentle evolution. The most noticeable improvement is that the game and servers don't crash all the time anymore. You can play continuously. It took 1 year to fix. The mod workshop that is right in the game is also funny. Despite assurances from Bohemia Interactive that it's finally working, there are always a number of problems. Vehicles are now fully simulated on the server. This creates several hard-to-fix phenomena. One of them is that when a vehicle collides with terrain or objects, the player sees something on the screen that isn't really happening. While there has been quite a bit of progress, the vehicles are still unreliable. The problem is that they are not reliable in situations where it is crucial. When you encounter an enemy, when you need to stop quickly or maneuver the vehicle somewhere through the terrain. FPS are pretty good in the game, but only when nothing is happening and the scene is empty. In multiplayer, performance drops as server load increases during gameplay, all reflected in the game client. The problems start when there are multiple players fighting in sight, vehicles, corpses, and thrown objects pile up. Performance drops in other cases as well. When spawning AI in a built-up base with particle effects, with some graphical settings despite the almost invisible effect on the game, and so on. And as in other games, when it rains or at night there is a significant FPS drop. Mainstream cards like the GeForce RTX 3060 should theoretically be enough to play in full HD. It supposedly runs worse on NVIDIA cards, but there's no benchmark in the game, so exact numbers are unknown. There can't be much talk about the game's overall smoothness. The player's camera, object movement, and even character animations aren't smooth and reflect various inaccuracies. Preparing a 3D scene, loading background data, and displaying what you should see is simply semi-functional. As problems accumulate over time, the hardware load increases. For servers, there is a clear tendency of performance degradation. It's very similar to DayZ, where servers have to restart regularly. It implies that the engine, even after 5 years of active development, can't manage game objects and memory properly. There can be problems in running scripts and so on. The developers are constantly working on it, but so far it hasn't stabilized much, and it's doubtful that it will be significantly better at some point. The servers only officially support 32 players, they lag, and the game client has similar problems. Another permanently bugged thing in Bohemia Interactive games is the game settings and configuration files in general. Everything works mysteriously. This is no different with the graphics settings or the key bindings. The game can look a little different every time, depending on whether you change the graphics settings while playing or restart the game. Not to mention other problems. The biggest difference in graphics settings is between low and medium. The game is ugly on low detail. The differences overall aren't very noticeable. They mostly have to do with showing details in the distance rather than changing the image quality significantly. Some graphical settings dramatically reduce FPS, such as environment quality. This somehow affects clouds and probably lighting as well. The difference between medium and ultra is imperceptible. The drop to 1/3 FPS is. If anyone thought Arma Reforger was going to be at least a little bit for a more hardcore audience, that the game would have more sophisticated mechanics, version 1.0 probably took away all illusions. The game doesn't have much overlap. Instead of a path to Arma 4, it's a path to Call of Duty, that is, to the point of being too arcadey. Version 1.0 made the whole game faster. The entire conflict mode on which the game is based is unbalanced and fails to create interesting game situations. The definitively stupid ideas now include rather arcade-like vehicle driving, the ability to communicate via microphone when you are unconscious, or the ability to teleport around the map after you have already spawned. Before you jump into the battlefield, you can try the tutorial, which is buggy and mostly boring. The main game mode Conflict is inspired by the game Squad. This system is open and dynamic as opposed to the purely static layout of player spawns on the game map. The principle isn't complicated. You capture points on the map, carry supplies, and spawn usually somewhere in the middle of the battlefield on your squad leader. In Reforger, it's all about capturing bases that are within radio range of your own bases. If you subsequently capture an enemy faction's base, you can build additional structures within it, including an antenna that improves the signal range. Somewhere in between all this, you should be carrying supplies, which are scattered variously around the map. Before version 1.0, despite a number of major problems, this worked at least a little and the game could be very fun. Changes in the wrong direction in the full version have fundamentally affected the gameplay. Despite zero balancing and other obvious flaws, the developers let it out into the world. Previously, it was possible to attack enemy supply routes because you had to carry supplies, and without logistics you weren't going anywhere. That's no longer the case at all. Instead, you're just trying to get to the enemy base quickly and conquer it. This is extremely difficult now. All you need to do is spawn defenders who have an extra 5 seconds of immortality, and the base can't be captured. Overall, the idea of bases is not a good one. The player-built base is a chaotic mess of tents that is impossible to navigate. It's not a place where combat is fun, and it's repetitive. One could imagine better gameplay for a game like this. In particular, it should be about fighting in the field, in populated areas. The battle should be continuous and the front should move to make progress felt. Then logistics should work in the rear. Players could also complete airborne missions that would give the team various advantages and such. Anything along those lines. What is in the game is disappointing. Driving around the map and taking bases from non-functioning AI or player-built bases is not good game content. Besides, it's unplayable due to the terrible in-game economy and other parameters. Sooner or later you will come across players who spoil the game. Until version 1.0, the voting system didn't work at all, and neither did the auto-kick for players who abuse friendly fire. Despite the developers' statements and the implementation of a system to monitor player actions, it's still practically the same. In the game, you can run around and shoot people without penalty so that they fall unconscious, and do a lot of other things like that. The Infusion engine and Arma Reforger itself are generously designed. Lots of great ideas and details that are a joy to explore. At first glance, you can see the well-done audio-visual, PR materials, and other things that cost a lot of work. But it's all rather misleading, and the Steam rating of around 60% speaks volumes. The downside compared to Arma 3 and DayZ is that it's not a classic project, but a tech demo crossed with a game that they did PR for and tried to look serious. In fact, the lifespan of Arma Reforger will probably be short. The lack of a mission editor, single player, usable AI, and other things puts this title on the back burner early on. The number of players increased noticeably with the release of the full version. Whether it will last is questionable. Bohemia Interactive has no big regrets. When the early access was launched a year and a half ago, the game was not even playable for 5 minutes straight. Now you can, but the feel is still the same. Arma 4 will probably be very Reforger-like, maybe indistinguishable. Basic game mechanics, scripts, game assets, and other things will be reused due to the effort put in. It'll just expand the amount of them, and maybe it'll be more polished. But it's not likely that the level of detail in the environment, the number of polygons, the overall scale of the game, and so on will change significantly. Everything is already sketched by Reforger, which encounters both the limits of the engine, that is not the best made, and the hardware limits in general. The next generation of consoles will come out sometime in 2028. They'll probably push Arma 4 to that date. How Bohemia Interactive will distinguish Arma 4 and Reforger as two different products will be interesting to see. Embrace yourselves. The technical side of Arma 4 is going to be a mess.